Hi, everyone. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Tim for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm really glad we were able to make this work even though we had the crazy weather a few weeks ago. And just to give you a sense of who I am trained as an ecologist, and I work a lot with insects. And recently I've been doing a lot of work on the ecology in cities of insects and their ecosystem services. And I'll be talking to you about some of those issues today. The title of the talk is From Broadway Avenue to Central Park, Ant Diversity, Invasions, and Diets Across Manhattan's Urban Habitat Mosaic. Okay, so I'll start with a point that may or may not be something that's known to you guys, but cities are disproportionately understudied. So one way to think about this is to ask how many ecology studies are conducted in different types of habitats if we compare it to the amount of the globe that's covered in that habitat. So this was recently done in a review by Martin et al. In 2012. And what they did was they looked at how much of the terrestrial inhabitable land area was covered by, for example, cities and protected areas. And here in this figure, the legend isn't there, so the white box is cities, and the black bar is protected areas, places like natural parks and reserves. So these places have approximately the same land area. There's a little less than twice as much land covered by protected areas compared to cities in the world. If we then look at how much ecology study has been done in those areas, though, it's way less for cities. So we see 15 times more, and that's percentage more. So we're talking about 70% compared to 5%. This is a big difference. And really, that's okay as long as what happens in cities is the same as what's happening in protected areas. And so we have an open question right now in urban ecology of, are predictions from studies of these protected areas appropriate for urban ecosystems? And are there times when cities essentially break the rules that we've found for protected areas in these studies? And we have some information about ecology and urban ecosystems. So there are two major spatial scales that people have really focused on so far. The first is this broad scale satellite imagery. And this is a pretty famous map of the United States from NASA that just shows the lights on at night. And that's a really good indicator of where people are, where these dense human establishments are across the entire planet. And we've been able to use this as a metric of urbanization and then test different hypotheses about cities and their ecology using that. We also have these finer scale, what we call urban to rural or rural to urban gradients. And there the idea is that if we start out in protected areas, go into farms, and then have cities as an endpoint, then we can understand how ecology changes along that gradient. The problem is that most of those studies consider cities as this endpoint where ecology doesn't happen, where everything just stops, and that's not the case. So we're starting to realize that really zooming in to cities and trying to understand the habitats within the cities is really important. And one reason that's important is that that's how animals and even plants are moving through the landscape. There are animals like birds that may be able to kind of have this coarse view, but for most animals, they're trying to get between habitats, and it's disjunct distribution. It's not this smooth gradient. Instead, we see a forest, and the closest possible habitats are all things like sidewalks. And so how animals get between these forests or even park areas in a matrix that's very different is something that's really interesting and largely unexplored. And that's part of what me and my lab group have been really excited about doing. So when we started thinking about where to study these questions, we decided to go to the most urbanized part of the most urban city in the U.S. And so we went to Manhattan, and this is a artist's depiction of what the island might have looked like before any development occurred, juxtaposed against what it looks like in the modern day. And a big take-home message of this kind of image is that we've really transformed this landscape. Another one that's really interesting that's recently been studied a little bit is that the area of the built environment in Manhattan is much larger than the area on the ground. And so when you're talking about the possible places where animals and plants and other organisms can live, the built environment represents these new niches, these new ecosystems that could be exploited, and often are. And across all of these different landscapes, we find ants. And ants are remarkably good at finding new places to live, and they're doing really important things to ecosystems. This is all over the world. We know that they're very important to a lot of ecosystem processes, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in a minute. But we know that they exist across this matrix and across this habitat mosaic. And so we were really interested in understanding, well, what species are we actually talking about, and what are they doing, and how is that affecting people? And so the first question you might ask is, why even study ants in urban ecosystems? And there's a lot of really good reasons. These are just a few. First, ants are widespread and diverse. They're found in almost every habitat on the planet, and we have about 15,000 species of ants in the world, and we know their identity for most of them. So we have a pretty good handle on that taxonomy and evolutionary relationships among ants. They also display variation in their nesting behaviors, the food they like to eat, and their associations with humans. So they end up being really good indicators of ecosystem function in some parts of the world, because some species start to come in as ecosystems recover from disturbance. And as I said, they're ecologically really important. So whether you're talking about the tops of the canopies of trees or below ground, ants are affecting a lot of different ecosystem processes, and they're influencing the diversity of other organisms in the environment. And so by understanding what's happening with ants, you really get a window into what's happening with other species and entire ecosystems. And they provide a tractable and easily identifiable study system. So we can look at them. They're not living for 200 years. They are identifiable. We can collect some workers without killing the colony, and so there's less of a stress to them to be studied. And so they become really attractive in these systems. And of course, there are a lot of ways that we can influence urban ants. There are three that my group have really focused on. And the first is that we can change chronic stress regimes. So what that means is, as opposed to the giant storm that comes through, we can affect the day-to-day disturbance that ants deal with. So whether it's increasing temperatures, as you see with urban heat islands, or it's increasing pollutants, reducing the area that the species can live in, all of these things increase chronic stress and may affect whether some species can live in a particular environment. So that's something we know we're doing. We're also modifying their nutrition. This picture here is of a Cheez-It with ants all over it. And we know that ants don't have a long evolutionary history of eating Cheez-Its or other human food. And so what we don't understand is the consequences of those changing diets as we change their nutrition. And because they affect so many different ecosystem functions, that's something we really want to get a handle on. And another way we affect them is that we create this inhospitable matrix, like I was talking about earlier, with forests being very close to streets and sidewalks. And so what that might end up doing is creating these isolated patches where species really can't move very far from where they are. And that sets the stage for rapid diversification, where we get species actually diverging, so potential new species emerging as a result of our selection pressures. This is something we're studying, but it's a much longer term project, so I'm not going to talk about it today. And as I said, we create these stress gradients in cities by developing these urban habitat mosaics. So at one end of this chronic environmental stress gradient are parks and forests, where there's bigger habitat area, there's less impervious surface, fewer pollutants. So these are low stress environments, or we expect to be closest to protected areas in the city. We go through many different habitat types like community gardens and street medians that are kind of intermediate. Then we get things like sidewalks and straight tree pits that are remarkably different from protected areas. And they also have very high chronic stress levels along a bunch of different axes. And so what we were interested in for this work is comparing these very low stress habitats in cities to the high stress habitats and medians that share some common characteristics. So these are about, we focused on Broadway Avenue in New York, and I'll show that slide in a minute. These habitats are really unique. So they're about 5 meters wide, 1 to 2 blocks long, and they have 2 lanes of traffic going either direction on either side. And right under these street medians is the New York City subway system. So there's not a lot of soil there, but there are lots of plants, we have trees, we have understory plants. So we have some structural characteristics that are very similar to these city parks and forests, which I'll be treating together. And so this becomes a really interesting way to think about comparing a very low stress to a high stress habitat within an urban habitat mosaic, which is what we were interested in doing. Okay, so we went to Manhattan and we asked, across these 2 different kinds of habitats, how does the composition of local ant assemblages vary by habitat type? So basically, what ant species are there? And what combination of different ant species can you find in these different types of habitat if we sample a bunch of them? And then we asked if the feeding preferences of ants differed across these high and low stress habitats. So for what I'm talking to you about today, we sampled in June 2011 and August 2012. We've actually sampled since then and gotten a similar story. We had street medians on Broadway and also nearby city parks. And that included the really kind of parkland parks that have playgrounds and sports fields, and also some forested parks that are managed as a forest. And to collect ants, we did a couple of things. So I did most of the collecting, and there are a few methods of doing it. On the bottom here is what we call a Winkler sifter. And so what we do there is we scoop up leaf litter and put it into that sifter. And so it just captures anything that's crawling around in the ground. And then we put that into an extractor that collects anything that was in there, so into ethanol. So that gets the things that are on the ground. But then there are other insects and ants in particular that are walking around on the plants, or they're underneath things like logs or rocks or even cement blocks, or an empty can of soda will often have insects inside them, and ants are really common. So the other thing we do is we use this thing called an aspirator that has a filter on it. So we use it by just sucking up the ants by putting that aspirator tube right on top of them. And so that allows us to sample the ones that aren't walking around on the ground. Okay, so coming into this, I had some predictions that followed the literature and what people have found out from protected areas. So if urban ants follow classic predictions of how ecosystems work along stress axes, then we might see a pattern like this, with our site type on the x-axis and the percent occurrence, so the percentage of those sites where different species were found. And as you can see from these bars, black is native and white is exotic. So the prediction here is that in parts we're going to see a few exotic ants present, but mostly native species. And the opposite for medians, where very few native species will be found, but those habitat conditions will really favor exotic species. And when I say exotic, I mean species that are native to other regions. And in addition, we also wanted to look at the composition, as I was telling you before. So the identity of the different ant species and kind of the combinations of different species of each site. And so that's what this plot shows. It's called an ordination, and the axes don't matter as much as the relative position of points in space. So here we have our factor of interest in habitat type, with parks as green circles, medians as gray X's. And what we expect is that there are only a subset of the species that can live in parks are able to live in street medians, and so we'll see this nested pattern where the medians are really clustered together, but the parks are really spread out far apart. So there's a lot more variety in the parks than there is in the medians. Alternatively, if there's something really special about cities and that these habitats are so different that species can only live in one place or another, we would likely see a pattern like this, where on the x-axis here we have relative occurrence, and there are ant species that are only found in parks and others that are only found in medians. Okay, so what did we find? If we first think about this question of exotic versus native ants, remember this is our prediction. What did we find? Well, for parks we were pretty close. We see a lot of native ants in parks and just a few exotic ant species able to live in parks. When we went over to the medians, we didn't find what we expected. We found basically the same number of exotic species in parks and medians. But there was a reduction in the number of native species able to live in medians. So only half of our prediction for medians was actually supported. And that's actually some pretty good news, because that means that there are some native ants that are able to survive alongside these exotics, and that native ants are also able to live alongside them in parks, so they're not being pushed out of park habitats. So remember I showed you this graph as a prediction of the overall compositional diversity. So this idea of a nested distribution, of medians being these really simple species combinations compared to parks. What we found was something a little different. So we're looking at the data from 2012, and the big symbols are just the averages, and the smaller symbols are each site. And what you can see is that parks were more spread out than medians were, but medians appear to be kind of occupying their own region of species space. So it's not just that they're a subset of the parks, apparently. But this is a little unclear, and so we've been doing more work to try to get at this. And part of the answer is in abundance, which we didn't look at in this study, but it's actually really important, where we see some species becoming hyperabundant in median habitats, and that might be why we're seeing some of these patterns. Okay, so what about this idea that we could have really different signals. So if we look species by species, we have park ants and we have median ants. Well, I'll show you the same figure, except we'll have a little category called both. So species that live only in parks, ones that live only in medians, and ones that are found in both parks and medians. Well, here we're getting more evidence that it might be a nested pattern. As if you can see, so we've got the relative occurrence on the x-axis. On the y-axis is just the names of the different species. There are a lot of species that were only found in parks. There are also quite a few species that were found in both parks and medians, and among those, there are a couple that are much more common in medians than they are in parks. But there are no species that were only found in medians. And so that's an interesting pattern, and one that's kind of like to call your attention to is this Tapinoma thessali at the top. The most common ant that we found in parks in this study was not found in any medians. That ant is the common house ant, the odorous house ant, Tapinoma thessali. And so it's really surprising to us that they weren't able to survive in this median environment, because we know that they can live among humans. Okay, so looking back at those predictions, we predicted that native ants would be more common in parks, and that was true. We found evidence for that. But we didn't find that exotic ants were more common in medians. We definitely found that medians and parks had different ant assemblages, but it's unclear if it's actually a nested pattern. We have evidence in both directions for that one. And then we found that there were species unique to park habitats, but while some ants were more common in medians, there were none that were only found in medians. And so that makes sense, and that's kind of supported by what people have found when they've used ants as indicators of ecosystem function. It's those kind of park ants that people wait to move in to show that an ecosystem is starting to recover from damage. Okay, so now let's think about what we're doing to modify their nutrition by putting mostly junk food out in the environment. There are a couple of ways to think about this. This is a similar picture that I took in Raleigh of some fire ants on a Cheeto. And we can think about this from a human perspective, asking, how much do they contribute to food removal services? Is this actually a service to people to have ants eating discarded food? And we can also think about it more in an ant-centric way. So how does human food affect ant ecology? And remember, I said that there's a lot of downstream effects for ecosystem processes and services other than food removal. So we'll first start with the human-centered approach. And across Manhattan, like many cities, including Raleigh, we have a lot of human food available. And so we'll see food trucks very commonly scattered throughout the city. We'll see people sitting even on those medians, in the middle of the medians, eating that food. I also see a lot of this picture of overflowing trash bins in the city. And of course, even if they're not overflowing, ants are very adept at going into trash cans and getting food. And in terms of thinking about this as an ecosystem service, we know that food waste in cities can attract and support population growth of undesirable species. And I think that's something that people generally kind of have an inherent sense of. If we leave food around, things like rats that carry disease and molds that are also associated with human health risks can grow, and that's not a positive thing for people living in those cities. What I think is less obvious to people is that even if food waste gets into a trash bin, it's still a problem for people in cities because it's going to these landfills. And so instead of having food removed at the source, it becomes part of this giant pile of decaying food waste. And that's a big problem in cities. Just to give you a few stats, We got North Americans generating more than half a kilogram per person per day of food waste in landfills. And each ton of that generates 125 meters cubed of greenhouse gases. When we talk about global climate change and the consequences of that, this is a big contributor to it. And when we think about which greenhouse gases are being produced in landfills, a lot of it is methane. And it doesn't get as much attention as carbon dioxide, but methane traps 21 times more heat than CO2 does. And so it's a really big concern. And there are a lot of different ways that people are trying to deal with it. For example, there's some efforts to try to trap some of that methane and use it for something else. But there's a lot of places in the world where that's just not a possibility. And really, we're not able to trap enough to account for the sheer volume of methane that's going into the atmosphere from cities. And with almost 8.5 million people, New York City generates around 150,000 meters cubed of methane every year. And that's a big input into the atmosphere. So this means that anything that urban animals like ants can do to remove the food before it gets to the landfills really is a big ecosystem service for people. And as I said, across this urban habitat mosaic, these really modified habitats, ants are there, they're performing important services and affecting ecosystem processes. But of course, there's other species there too. And I'm collaborating with a friend from Fordham University, Jason Winchie South, to examine some effects, some interactions between rodents and ants. And one interesting thing he's found so far in his research is that in the very modified areas of the city, so these high-stress habitats, the only rodents you find are rats, and you see a lot of them. New York City is kind of known for it. But if you go into the low-stress habitats like forests, instead you see these little native mice. You also see a lot of squirrels and other rodent life. And so we have this difference in the rodent population to go along with the complicated story of the ant population. And the interesting thing is that all of these species are really adept at scavenging for food. We wanted to know, if food removal is a service, like I just argued, who's providing that service? Is it really the rodents, or can ants play an important role? And so as a starting point for understanding this question, we conducted a short-term little feeding trial. So we had 3 types of food: hot dogs, cookies, and potato chips. So we have the really salty, high protein, high sugar foods that are processed, and they're similar to what would be dropped on the ground in a median or a park if there's people around the park. And what we did was we put out either those baits under cages like you see in this first picture, or open and freely available. And so we've had observations that show that when you cage food like this, it's almost all ants coming in. Every once in a while you get a little roly-poly, an isopod come in, but mostly it's ants coming in to collect those foods. And at least in medians, the vertebrates that come are mostly rats. There's a few birds that come in, but they tend to ignore human foods in the medians. Certainly seen them eat human foods other places, but in those medians, they don't appear to be providing much of that service. Okay, so we asked how much of this service is being provided by the ants. And here are the results for the potato chips. And we did use Lay's potato chips. Okay, so in this graph, we have, again, along the x-axis is the site type, and sorry for the flip in the axis labels, the medians are on the left this time. And then we looked at the amount of food that was removed in a day. And if we first look at the parks, you can see that if we compare the dark bars, which are inside the cage, to the white bars, which are outside the cage, vertebrates are removing about as much as arthropods are. So there's a really big difference. And arthropods aren't doing the lion's share of the removal. And as I said, those arthropods are almost all ants. If you go to the medians, a really different picture emerges, and it's a surprising picture. Because we really expected to see rats be voracious scavengers. And so we thought they would be better at removing human food, but they weren't. If you look in the medians, ants are collecting more of that human food, and there's no significant difference. Even if you allow rats access to the food, ants are doing most of that removal. And that was true for these potato chips, but it was also true for cookies and hot dogs. We see the same story happening. In medians, ants are doing most of this work. So in these very urbanized habitats, it is important to consider the ants and their services. We have plans to do much longer-term ant and rat exclusion experiments in these medians to really tease apart how competitive dynamics over time affect these ants and rats and the humans that they help out in the city. Okay, so that was a very human-centric approach. What if we think about it from the ant's perspective? Does it change their biology when ants eat human food? Are they changing anything? Well, we started by thinking about that. By thinking about what is a diet, a common diet of an ant in a protected area, or someplace that's not as modified. Well, a huge part of ant diets is insect prey. These are these composite foods that have, fats and salts and sugars and proteins. And the other thing they have is they have a lot of plant nectar in their diets, either from directly feeding on nectar, or, as this picture below shows, we have ants tending aphids. This is a really common mutualism all over the world, where aphids are these little bugs that suck up plant sap, and they have to eat a lot of it because it doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. And so then they have this excess sugar water that goes through their gut. It's called honeydew that they just secrete. And it's highly attractive to ants. And what ants will do is they will collect that honeydew from the aphids and then protect the aphids from their natural enemies. So it's one of the ways that ants have major influences on plants is through this mutualism. So these are the big sources of food in ant diets. What happens when you go from these sources to such processed foods as hot dogs, cookies, and potato chips? The first way I started working with this was to conduct some food preference trials. These have been done all over the world. So what you do is you basically take out the components of those composite diets. You take out the water as a control, and then salt water, sugar water, amino acids in solution, which is the protein, and then extra virgin olive oil, which is the fat. So take apart those preferences, offer them all as liquids in these stations. And what you do is see how many ants come to each of these baits. And that tells you something about their colony. So we know from all over the world two things. One, what they prefer tells you something about the status of the colony. So if a colony has a lot of brood, so eggs and larvae and pupae, then they tend to need a lot of protein in order to grow that colony. If they're at a stage in their growth where they have a lot of adults and they just need to go out and get food to sustain the adults' workers and their metabolism, they tend to greatly prefer sugars. And so it's usually, that's the second thing. that has been shown all over the world in all sorts of different habitats is that it tends to be a story about proteins versus sugars. So we did this in city parks, in these low-stress habitats, compared to street medians, higher-stress habitats. And we had some predictions based on those studies. So again, we expected most of the story to be about these proteins and sugars. And because there's a lot fewer insect prey available in the medians, we expected the ants to really go for the protein pack that was the amino acids. And that's been shown in some of these other studies. But because there are more insects that live in parks, we didn't think that would be as important there. And we also have found in some other studies that a little bit of salt is really important for ant colonies and their growth. But because there's so much salt available along streets, we didn't think that was going to be a real limiting factor in street medians, so we expected we might see a little bit more of a preference for salt in the parks. And then oil and water were really just in there because it's a part of their diet. We didn't expect to see much of a preference for either of those. So what did we find when we went to the city and we used these predictions? Something completely different. So we'll start with the parks because they're a little bit more aligned with what we found other places in the world. And in the parks, ants are kind of acting like ants. Most of the time they went for sugars. It was in August, and that's a time when adults are out foraging a lot, and so that's not terribly surprising. What was surprising was that almost none of them went for the amino acids. More went for water and salt water than amino acids. So they didn't appear to need those. They did go for oils, so this fat part of their diet, which, as I said, has been done all over the world and has never been important in any of these studies. So this is a big, surprising, interesting result. Then we go to the medians, and it's even bigger. We see almost 80% of the ants and medians went for the fats, and sugars were next. So one explanation for this is that there's just different species going to these states. And so I separated out the most common species in street medians, which is the pavement ant, Tetramorium, and asked the same question. So what proportion of Tetramorium in these different sites was at each of these baits? And here is where it gets crazy, because over 90% of pavement ants in parks went for sugars. And it completely swapped to over 90% going for oils in street medians. And this is a really strong effect. You don't often see over 90% of anything in an ecology study. And so that suggests that something really important is happening in street medians. And we went back to this idea that there's less insect prey, and that's really where they mostly get their fats. And it could be that they are just not getting the kind of fats that they need. So most insects store fat as part of these fatty acid chains, and one of the big chains that's common is this oleic acid. And that's actually found in extra virgin olive oil. And so they may not be getting the kind of food they need, the kind of fat they need, out of this human food. And so we went back just last September, and we gave them some options. So we gave them crickets, which, ant health food, and then we gave them cookies, hot dogs, and potato chips, and watched them for 2 hours to see what the pavement ants in Broadway's medians did. So here I've got the time elapsed, and then the percentage of those pavement ants at each of those bait types. And I've got a dotted line at 25% because there are 4 bait types. So if there's no choice, you would expect them to hover kind of around 25%. We first look at the crickets. It's definitely not happening here. So within the first 20 minutes, all of those pavement ants are at the cricket, and that kind of goes down over time. Look at these other foods. They do hover right around 25% and only start to increase after the crickets have, the percent going to the crickets is really low. And so there's a couple of things that could be going on. I mean, we could have them really wanting those natural fats and other things found in crickets early on and then getting everything they need and going down. But I don't think that's what's going on, because this is really common. So this is a picture of the baits after 2 hours. And you can see that there are pavement ants in approximately equal proportions at the hot dogs, the cookies, and the potato chips. But the crickets are completely picked clean. So they are voraciously attacking insects that come into their habitat. And this is something that suggests that maybe the reason, a big reason, why we don't see other insects in these mediums is that the ants living here are so voracious for insect prey. So they could be keystone predators in these really urbanized habitats. And that's something that we'll be testing next year. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to a bunch of people that collaborated with me and helped me during this project, and funding sources that helped make this possible, and take any questions you guys might have. So the first question is, what do we know about ants in vertical buildings? And that's a great question. We know some. We've done some preliminary work where we had an entomologist go into houses, human homes in North America, really in this area, Raleigh, and pick up every living and dead arthropod. So arthropods are insects and spiders and their relatives. And ants are one of the most common species that come into houses, but only a few ants actually do come into the houses. And so we don't really know about the factors that are structuring them coming in, because there are so many different sources, and that's something that has become a very big interest recently. And so hopefully we'll get more information, especially looking not just at standalone homes, but apartments, where we've seen that for things like microbes. A lot of the apartments basically just look like, my boss likes to say, like an exploded human, because it's all these human-associated microbes all over an apartment, whereas in a house you see a lot coming in from outside. So the second question here is, are there any experiments to see if the park ants prefer the natural source of sugars? That's a great question and a good idea. It's not something that we've done yet. And there has been some work in protected systems, looking at the preferences of ants for just sucrose in solution, which is what we used, compared to aphid honeydew and plant nectar. And there isn't a really big difference between plant nectar and sucrose, because most of nectar for a lot of plants is sucrose. Most of the sugars are, something like 70 to 90% sucrose. But when they go through the aphid gut, in that mutualism I was telling you guys about, they get a lot more amino acids. And so in some systems, ants will show a preference for aphid honeydew, and it appears to be that they're selecting for those amino acids that are in that, but not in plant nectar, and also not in sucrose solutions. But that's a great question, and it's something that would be fun to do in cities. So the next question is, do you think your research results would be different in different cities? And I think that that's definitely a possibility. And we have some plans to go into Chicago and New York and do some work in Raleigh to compare these results. But I think that because the species are so common across different cities, we're probably going to see similar results. It'll be really interesting. I have some ideas of doing some of this work in other countries, and that will be really interesting because there are fewer similarities in the ant species that are shared. Because of exotic species being spread all over the place, though, we do have a lot, like pavement ants are in almost every city in the world. They're really successful at getting there. But there are also other contexts there too. And we're also producing different kinds of food in different parts of the world. And so we're really excited to think about this beyond New York. Okay, so the next question is, could you talk a little about the School of Ants? Yeah, sure. So this is a project that we have going. It's now worldwide. We've got modules in Australia, in Italy, and Denmark. And what it is we have mostly kids go into their green and paved spaces, so their front yard and sidewalk, for example, or a school field and its basketball court, let's say. And they put out these cookies called pecan sandies, which have been used by ant biologists since the early 90s to collect ants because they're a good composite food. So the kids put these cookies out, and they leave them for an hour on a little white card. And then after an hour, they come back, they put them all in a plastic baggie and seal it up and send it to us. And then our undergraduates sort through those samples, get out the species, and curate them, and then send them to taxonomic experts across the country and now the world. And so we get real identifications that then get posted online in this big global ants map. So we're running it for the U.S. So you can go to yourwildlife.org or schoolofants.org, and you can look at any place. You can type in someone's address if you know it, or you can just click on a dot on the map, and what you can see is what species were living in their green environments and what species were living in their paved environments. And we have that data from across the whole country. And so it's data that we could never have gotten on our own, at least not in that time frame, which was, it's in real time, people are collecting data across the country. And so it's really interesting for people to get that information about their own backyards. It's also really interesting for us because we're starting to get a picture of ant diversity across this really broad spatial scale. And we're starting to be able to track species invasions. So we've got a species known as the Asian needle ant that was really only known from the Carolinas. As indicated by its common name, it's from Asia. It's from Japan, actually. And it's a really pretty nasty invader. It's got a really potent sting, and it's competitively superior to a lot of other species of ants. But we thought it was just in this area. Through School of Ants collections, we found it, or our partners found it, our citizen science partners found it, in upstate New York, in Wisconsin, and all the way over in Washington State, near the Vancouver border. So this means that with these kinds of data, we can track invasions really early on and have a better chance of success at keeping them from being really problematic. And so that's really exciting. And right now we're kind of phasing into a new part of the project where we have people across the country do some feeding trials similar to what I was telling you about with the liquid bait stations to try to understand some of these food preferences as they change across the country. And because we can keep track of when those data were collected, we can see things like seasonality and how that affects those preferences. Okay, so the next question is, could you talk a little bit about your collections from when you came here to UVA? Could you talk about your findings at the School of Architecture in the downtown mall. Yeah, so that was a while ago, so I don't remember the exact species, but I just went around collecting ants using that hand collection method I told you guys about for about an hour or two one afternoon. And I think it was about 8 species of ants that I found. And there were the really common ants we found. I remember that I found pavement ants and carpenter ants. Found a lot of winter ants, which are kind of a fun ant. It's a native species that instead of kind of hibernating during the winter, it does the same thing. It's called estivating if it's in the summer, but basically hibernates in the summer and then comes out when conditions are cooler. And this ant is really interesting also because it has these workers called repletes that collect a bunch of either sugars or sometimes fats, less commonly fats. And their abdomens just expand, and they basically just become this big storage vessel for the colony. So their sisters will walk up and antennate to them, tap them with their antennae, and then they'll give them a drop of whatever food they're holding. And that's all they do. They just sit there and hold that food. And so it's really kind of fun. If you've heard of honeypot ants in the Southwest, U.S. Southwest, they do the same thing. And they're more famous. But yeah, we've got these ants called the winter ant in the South, and there were a lot of those. And I think, yeah, I can't remember the other species, but I think mostly it was a common species that you see. But there was one I remember that was, I think, a hypoponera, which is a specialized hunter. So all they do is eat other insects. They don't take any kind of plant nectar. They don't, scavenge for anything. They're solely predators. And we've actually found in urban ecosystems they're doing pretty well, which wasn't what we expected. We thought they would be one of the first species to go. But. So the last question is, you've spoken about ants as predators, but what about ants as prey? They can be prey for some species. They're not, in general, really great food sources for other animals. So birds don't tend to bother because they're almost all exoskeleton, the workers. What is a really good food source is the larvae. And so there are specialized predators that go into ant nests and raid the larvae. Some of those are other ants. There are also some species that have a specialized role as ant predators. There are things like ant lions that you find in desert environments, and they make this whirlpool in the sand, kind of like this, and the ants walk across it and fall in. And the ant lion, the larvae, just has its jaws open like this and snaps the ants. And it takes a lot of ants, though, to have any kind of nutrition, and that's why a lot of species don't really feed on ants unless they have a way of getting to their prey. And so in the tropics, you see more of these specialized ant hunters, ant eaters, and there are a lot of ants in the tropics too, so that's part of it. But yeah, they're not big prey items for most other organisms. Thank you. It was really nice being able to talk with you guys, kind of, and I really am glad that we were able to work something out. Thank you. Well, feel free to send me an email. The first slide had my email address on it. If anyone has any follow-up questions or wants to talk about insects in cities, because it's very exciting stuff to me. Okay, thanks a lot.